This week's podcast, 3 Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporters. How do you get women to tell their stories of sexual harassment and assault and hold men accountable? Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey will be here to talk about their new book, She Said. What is life like in the world's essentially ungoverned oceans? Ian Urbina will be here to talk about his book, The Outlaw Ocean, Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier. Alexander Alter will be here with the latest in publishing news. Plus, we'll talk about what we and the wider world are reading. This is the Book Review Podcast from the New York Times. I'm Pamela Paul. Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey join us now. They are both Pulitzer Prize-winning reporters for The Times. Their new book is called She Said, Breaking the Sexual Harassment Story That Helped Ignite a Movement. Jodi, Megan, thanks for being here.
We're thrilled to be here.
Thanks for having us.
So your book has been out for a few days now. It's already getting a lot of reaction. Has anything surprised you in terms of what people are looking at, what the reaction has been?
I think our main reaction is actually relief, because so much of the book was secret for so long, either in that it was sort of the backstory to the original Times and investigation, and a lot of that was off the record and we couldn't talk about it, or for the last year or so we've had these new discoveries that we were holding for the book. And usually we're used to holding things for the newspaper for, a month, 2 months, 3 months, but we were sitting on some of this stuff for a long time. And so there's just been this incredible satisfaction in the last few days in being able to share.
Books are slow. I was going to ask about that, too, because you sort of have two processes here, the whole story behind the story of reporting and then what came after the book. At what point did you decide in the process of reporting on Harvey Weinstein and others that this was going to be a book? This wasn't just going to end with the stories in the paper.
I think that we realized pretty quickly after the first Weinstein story in October 2017 that was really just the beginning. In that first story, we had been able to piece together some of the dots of Weinstein's predation going back over the decades and how he had been able to conceal it. But there was still so much more to learn about, one, the machinery that was in place to silence his accusers and try to stop scrutiny, and also just the question of complicity. How do individuals and institutions like the Weinstein Company, for example, become complicit in abuse? And so I think we pretty quickly recognized that there was much more to say and much more to report, and that we were still grappling with a lot of questions that needed to be answered.
So there were people who would not go on the record for the stories in the paper, but then decided to let you make them public in the book. How hard was it to get them to go on the record, and sort of what made them decide to come forward publicly once this was going to be a book?
It really varied depending on the situation. I'll give you 2 super quick examples. Erwin Ryder, Weinstein's former accountant, he worked for him for about 30 years. He was still working for him when he became sort of the deep throat of our investigation. Very early on in the book process, we talked to Erwin about whether he'd be willing to be named. And we wanted to do that not only to kind of show our work and show how this kind of investigation works, but because Erwin's story of being a man at that company, seeing glimpses of some wrongdoing, not acting, becoming increasingly concerned, trying to intervene and failing is so key to talking about all these issues about the workplace and what you do if you see something wrong. Rowena Chu, who goes on the record for the first time in this book, she's a very sort of central Weinstein victim because there was so much cover-up involved in her story. And when we tried to reach her in the summer of 2017, she would not speak to us. She would not answer messages. There's a story in the book of me going to her house and having an incredibly awkward conversation with her husband because he did not know. She had never told him what had happened with Weinstein. So for Rowena, coming forward was a huge decision, a very careful decision, an emotional decision, and she had to make sure that she was truly ready, even 2 years after so many Weinstein victims had come forward. And it was really, Megan, I think it was only April or May that we got the news that she would be fully on the record in this book.
You mentioned getting people to go on the record, and that's one of the things that I think has brought about comparisons to All the President's Men, which is the sort of the TikTok behind the story, the how you got people to talk. And I'm curious, like going back now to your initial reporting, how hard was it to get people to go on the record to begin with?
It was extremely difficult. We were up against this kind of cloak of secrecy in Hollywood that had protected Weinstein for years. I mean, people had been in sort of hushed conversations and at parties and in the private of people's homes, people had been whispering about Weinstein and his alleged predation for years. But women were terrified to come forward with their allegations against him. He was such a powerful broker in Hollywood that people feared that they would be the ones to suffer damage to their careers and reputations if they went on the record. And then we were also up against these secret settlements that have been used to silence not just some of Weinstein's victims, but also victims of sexual harassment and sexual assault around the country. And so, for example, there was a woman who had worked at Miramax in 1990. It was her first job out of college, and she was allegedly sexually assaulted by Weinstein, the boss. And right away, he kind of swooped in and forced a secret settlement on her in which she accepted money in exchange for silence. So there was a moment when I tracked her down in the course of our investigation at a home outside Manhattan and knocked on her door. She comes to the door. She's got a young daughter by her side looking up at her. And she says, "I explain why I'm there." And she says, "I've been waiting for this knock on my door for 25 years. But because she had been strangled into silence through this settlement, she was also terrified to speak out. And we ran into that time and time again. And so we were sort of going up both against this kind of culture of secrecy and then also these actual legal instruments that have been used to silence women.
I want to get to the legal challenges in a minute, but just talking about getting people to go on the record, obviously that was a big part of All the President's Men, and also Spotlight, the movie based on the Boston Globe reporting about the Catholic Church scandal. And two things strike me as different about this. One is that in this case, the victims are largely women, and talking about something that, I guess you could compare it obviously to Spotlight in that it's about sexual abuse, and that's something where there's a lot of shame and secrecy. But with women, there's also even more of a power dynamic. But that also you're doing this story at a moment at which journalism is perhaps as a profession more under attack than any other time maybe in recent history. And I'm curious if that second part lent to a mission of we really want to show just how careful we were and just how hard it is to do this work and what's involved.
You're exactly right. We wanted to show two things. The first is exactly what you're talking about, that we don't just throw these allegations into the paper. We wanted to show how painstaking the process is. But the second thing we wanted to show, and this became much clearer to us after we saw the impact of the Weinstein story, we wanted to show that facts really can serve as the basis for social change. When the Weinstein stories were published, including those by Ronan Farrow, so a totally independent publication.
The New Yorker.
The New Yorker was doing its own work, also came up with a devastating set of facts. And so the debate afterwards wasn't really about, did Harvey Weinstein do anything bad to women? Do we believe any of this stuff? It was about, what sort of reform does our society need? How do we need to change? How do we think about these problems differently? And so what we find hopeful about this book is that we want to show people that even at a time when so much is stuck and when the notion of truth almost seems to be fracturing, reporting still can make a difference.
So Harvey Weinstein, as you alluded to here, he was known widely behind the scenes to be not a good guy. And yet many other news organizations tried to get this story. What made you guys think that you could do it where they failed?
That was part of the enticement.
Yeah. Well, and I think listen, I think it's also a testament to, if you're talking about the kind of media landscape in America right now, I think it's worth pointing out that it's not just that the president is calling the press the enemy of the people. The media landscape has also suffered serious financial hits. And so there are a lot of news organizations that have been required to shrink and cut their resources. And I think that here at the New York Times, we were just so grateful to have an institution that was able to put the time and the resources behind this type of investigation. I mean, there were moments along the way, as we describe in the book, where we weren't even sure we were going to be able to obtain the truth and get to the finish line. And there were times where we'd knock on people's doors and they'd say, listen, you're not the first journalist to come knocking. And I worked with, another reporter back in the day. And guess what? That story went nowhere.
Did that make it even harder then for people to sort of go through the trauma of all this?
I think it was a challenge. I think that there was I think we ran into some skepticism with some of these phone calls and some of these door knocks when there were people who had spoken to other journalists only to see those investigations fail. And what we'd say is listen, we can't tell you what's happened in these other scenarios. All we can tell you is that we're sort of showing up with the whole support of the New York Times behind our back all the way up to the top of the institution.
I think that another thing people don't really have a good idea about is all of those stories that sort of don't quite make it into the paper because you can't get people to go on the record, you can't get the corroboration that's necessary. I'm curious how the two of you got started on this because, Megan, you had been reporting when Donald Trump was still a candidate on accusations that came forward. Had you two worked on any stories together before, and how did that happen that both of you began working on this one?
No, we barely knew each other. Megan had joined the Times. You joined the Times in 2016.
2016, yeah.
Right, and I had been here a lot longer. And so we had met, and I think maybe we had coffee or lunch once or something, but we really did not know each other. And the truth is that I didn't think Megan was that friendly. It turns out that she
rough crowd.
It turns out that she was just very intently focused on her Trump reporting, of course, during the 2016 election. But Megan was on maternity leave in the spring of 2017 when I started on the Weinstein story. And I was all alone on a very difficult story. And Rebecca Corbett, our editor, said to me one day, I think you should call Megan Twohey for advice. She's done a lot of this kind of reporting. And on that first phone call, something really did click between the two of us. But then there was some suspense because Megan wasn't going to be back from maternity leave for a few weeks, and she had the choice of what to work on, and I really hoped she would come work with me on this.
Well, this is something that people don't talk about a lot, which is the fact that as reporters are doing their job, they also have families. Maggie Haberman has 3 kids. You have 3 girls between the two of you, and both of you did this while you had very young daughters. And this is incredible, stressful reporting. What was that like doing this? And I imagine you're, going home and feeding your baby at night.
Yeah, I mean, spoiler alert, yes, it was hard. But this really was a moment in which we would be spending our days tracking down sources and, trying to obtain documents and then going home to sleep train. So that
kind of puts things into perspective. Which was harder?
Yeah, sometimes people will ask me, were you guys ever scared of Harvey Weinstein? And I always say, there's one person I'm scared of. She's 2.5. She's the one person who can intimidate me and bully me. There are so many reporters, investigative reporters, other types of journalists, and just working folks across this country who do tough jobs with, balancing parenting with this work. And I think that what we realized is that I think especially with the issues of sexual harassment and sexual assault, and I think you see this now kind of in the midst of the Me Too era, is that all parents, whether it's parents of daughters, parents of sons, actually feel that much more committed to this issue because they want to make sure that their kids are growing up in a world with adequate protections and fairness. And so while parenting could feel like a challenge at times, it was also a motivating factor.
Jodi, you mentioned you've been at the Times for a while and you've done a lot of different things. One of them was reporting on the challenges that women who particularly work at hourly jobs like, Starbucks have to take care of their children, to do basic things like nurse and pump while they're working full time. But you've also been the editor of Arts and Leisure. You reported on the Obamas. You reported on Amazon. Was there anything different about this story that from what you had previously done at the paper that sort of made you think okay, this is something entirely new here, or a particular challenge that you hadn't encountered before?
I think what might be surprising is that this investigation felt like something bigger from the beginning, not even really because of Weinstein, but because of the context here in this building, which is that In the spring of 2017, Emily Steele and Michael Schmidt broke the Bill O'Reilly story. They were able to show that O'Reilly and Fox had paid women off for many years to silence accusations of sexual harassment. And then the really astonishing thing is that after we published the story, O'Reilly lost his job. And the idea that a figure that powerful could be fired, not because of those allegations, because Fox had known about those allegations, but because of public exposure of those allegations, was like a real, hey, wait a minute, moment at the paper. And the editors asked a question that now sounds a little quaint, but they asked, are there other powerful men in American life who have covered up stories of abuse? And so we worked with a whole team. There were reporters looking at Silicon Valley, Katie Benner. There were reporters like Susan Chira and Katrin Einhorn did the story about the Ford factory workers. We were making inquiries about academia. We were looking into restaurant workers. And so from the beginning, the focus was really on looking at these issues across industries. And also the two words that came up really early in the process were complicity and enablement. The project from the beginning was conceived not as this industry or this predator or that predator, but there's a structural problem here. There's a systemic problem here. And so even those early first few months of Weinstein investigation always played out in that context, in our own building and in our own meetings. So the fact that now, 2.5 years later, we're having this really broad social conversation about, for example, secret settlements, that is so gratifying because back then we sat in these conference rooms and said, are we really going to be able to get people interested and understand these obscure legal instruments?
I mean, a lot of it does seem to hinge on money. And when, in cases like O'Reilly, that it sort of becomes a question of, well, will the advertisers pull out? Like, are we going to lose money in this? And as you mentioned earlier, there was a lot of complicity on the part of all of these organizations, generally for-profit companies, in terms of having non-disclosure agreements, threatening people with legal team. And another thing, Jodi, that you bring to this that is a bit unusual for most journalists is that you went to law school.
Well, I actually dropped out of law school. I was a journalism junkie, but never sort of gave myself permission to think that I could actually be the one writing the stories or editing the stories. I thought you'd have to be a total narcissist to think that you could do that. But I did drop out of law school when I realized that I wanted to give myself a shot at journalism. But, I've been thinking about it more recently because this reporting and this book has caused us to really struggle with these questions about the law. As a lot of people have pointed out, lawyers like Lisa Bloom and David Boies do not come out looking well in this story. And I think that part of what we're grappling with is this deeper question of the law is supposed to be our arbiter of right and wrong, but is it functioning in that way on these issues, or has it abdicated its role?
Well, lawyers here for the New York Times played a major role in this investigation, right? You had to have the power of the institution in terms of helping you confront some of these figures, dealing with what do we do if the person has a non-disclosure agreement? Again, going back to the sort of tick-tock of this story, how important for you was it to show everything that's involved in a big investigation like this?
We thought it was extremely important, and I think that it's unusual for readers to actually get the sort of behind-the-scenes look at how we do this work. And so we spent a lot of time in the reporting of the book and figuring out ways to get, for example, off-the-record meetings that we engaged in the course of our reporting onto the record so that readers could see for themselves. They could be in the room when Harvey Weinstein barged into the New York Times the day before the story was published.
Were you scared?
No, not scared. I think we were just scared that, in the process of working with his high-powered lawyers and the private investigators that he had promised $300,000 to if they could bring a halt to our investigation, we were worried for our sources. We were worried that he was going to be able to do something to try to kind of manipulate all the hard work we had done off the page. And so it wasn't so much scary, but it felt like the final 2 days leading up to publication were just a total wild ride. And so one of the more dramatic moments was when he did, in fact, barge into the New York Times with lawyers, including Lisa Bloom and Linda Fairstein and Elkin Abramovich by his side. And he had, he came in with these folders full of information, photos of some of his accusers and friendly poses with Weinstein and other information that he thought he might be able to use to smear them and be able to stop our investigation. That was something that had taken place off the record. He had basically showed up to the Times unannounced. And so we worked really hard to get that meeting onto the record so that readers could be in the room with us as that played out. That's just one example. There were other examples like, Jodi had worked with Erwin Ryder, the accountant, who ended up serving as a deep throat figure in the investigation. And so to be able to show readers what it was like when she was meeting with him in these sort of hushed meetings at a restaurant in Tribeca, this is just one of the examples of all the kind of behind the scenes action that happens as you're trying to get an investigation like this to the finish line that I think readers will be surprised to see.
I want to end with both where this book ends and also with where it began, because Megan, you, as you mentioned, were looking into allegations against then-candidate Donald Trump in 2016, and you end with Christine Blasey Ford. In both of these instances, the accusations did not result in the accused being brought down. What's the difference?
Well, one thing we've seen again and again is that there's a big difference with how these stories play out in the political sphere versus the non-political sphere. If you look at the O'Reilly story, the Weinstein story, Louis C.K., Les Moonves, a lot of the sort of big Me Too journalistic investigations that were non-political, they were very complicated and people had heated opinions, but they didn't play out on the gladiatorial battlefield of American politics. Then let's look at the political stories for a second. Not only Trump and Kavanaugh, but let's go back to Bill Clinton. Let's go back to Clarence Thomas. Those stories turn into holy wars where they take on all of the energy and poison of these big political fights, and it can sometimes feel like it's not even about the women anymore at the end of the day.
Do you think it's also about the fact that there isn't any bottom line to worry about, that there aren't those advertisers, the sort of money that will get pulled that will make it easier for someone to make a decision, okay, this person has to go?
One of the interesting questions that came up in the last couple of years was, what if Donald Trump hadn't run for president? And what if the Me Too era had taken off in earnest with all these other men being held accountable for their behavior? What would have happened to Donald Trump if he had faced all these allegations at a time when he was still just running his company and running The Apprentice? Would there have been consequences then?
It's a very good question. I suspect that neither of you is done with this investigation. Are you still looking into stories around Me Too?
Oh, sure. Absolutely. Our attitude is that you can't solve a problem you can't see. So Megan and I can't adjudicate all of the controversies around Me Too. But what we can continue to do is bring information to light in a responsible way and uncover this secret history that so many of us are still trying to understand.
Are women still reaching out to you?
We got a new wave when the book was published.
And to be continued. Jodi, Megan, thanks so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey are the authors of the best-selling book, She Said, Breaking the Sexual Harassment Story That Helped Ignite a Movement. So here's a request for our listeners. I get lots of feedback from you, some complaints, lots of kind words. Really appreciate it. You can always reach me directly at books@nytimes.com. I will write back. But you can also, if you feel moved to do so, review us on any platform where you download the podcast, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or Google Play or somewhere else. Please feel free to review us and, of course, email us at any time. Alexandra Alter joins us now with some news from the publishing world. Hi, Alexandra.
Hi, Pamela.
What are we going to talk about?
So there are a lot of huge books out this week, and one of them is She Said by Jodi Kantor and Megan Twohey, our colleagues here at The Times, who I believe listeners will hear from on the podcast, which is very exciting. And this book caught my eye. Not only was there major news in it, which I'm sure they'll elaborate on, but it's part of a wave of books that kind of have emerged from the reporting around the Me Too movement. And this one is kind of one of the first major ones, but there's a bunch of other books that are coming out this fall and, further into next year. And what's interesting to me is, we often see publishers latching onto a news moment. There was, of course, the Trump bump, and that was a lot of those books were hugely successful for publishers, but then some of them weren't. And so you're sort of curious which social issues are readers going to gravitate towards, which ones are going to kind of have a lasting impact, and which ones will there be an audience for. I was interested to learn that an industry study group had actually looked at this question. The Codex Group, which looks at book buying habits and reader preferences, had done a survey of more than 4,000 book buyers. And they asked them about their support for the Me Too movement. And somewhat surprisingly, but maybe not surprisingly, book buyers are more supportive of the Me Too movement than the general population. 60% of book buyers support the Me Too movement compared with 45% of the general population.
That's because book people are just better.
Book people are better. And book buyers are overwhelmingly women also. So you can see that playing into it. But I think there's another factor here, which is that even though a lot of these books that are coming out, including Jodi and Megan's book, which looks at the Harvey Weinstein investigation, the impact that it had, and also kind of behind the scenes of how they reported it. Other books, like a forthcoming one about the Jeffrey Epstein scandal. There are books about the former CBS chief executive Les Moonves coming out, books about Larry Nassar. They kind of tap into a cultural moment as well. So even though these were big journalistic investigations that broke news, I think a lot of these books are stepping back and looking at how sexual harassment flourished for so many decades, how it was acknowledged, it was an open secret, it was almost accepted. There were these legal forces that sort of kept it in place, these very restrictive non-disclosure agreements, lawyers for victims who were profiting off of the non-disclosure agreements. So the systematic enabling of sexual harassment, which allowed men to keep their positions and victims to quietly go away without raising alarms, I think is something that's being exposed. And then, of course, there's the cultural response to it and, whether things are going to change. I'm very curious to see what else is in Ronan Farrow's book. He has a big Weinstein book coming out in October from Little Brown. And like Jodi and Megan's books, she said it's heavily embargoed. I think there's going to also be big news in there. He's going to look at the forces he was up against when he was trying to report the same story they were. And, there was everything from a spy organization, an Israeli private investigation firm that was tracking the reporters.
Is this Black Cube?
It's Black Cube, yeah. Tracking the reporters and intimidating sources, trying to get them to clam up, to, legal threats, to, we'll find out more about what he was in particular facing. I heard him speak at Book Expo, as you did earlier this year, and he kind of alluded to his family history, too. Of course.
Sounds like that's going to be in there.
Yeah, I think it might be. He's Mia Farrow's son. And he supports his sister, Dylan Farrow, who has accused Woody Allen of sexual abuse. And, the family is sort of divided over that. The public is somewhat divided. So I think for him, there's a personal element, too, that will distinguish his book. And I was interested to see, too, that Penguin Press, which published She Said by Jodi and Megan, is also publishing another Weinstein book by Ken Aletta.
Writer for The New Yorker.
Yes, the New Yorker writer who had himself pursued this story going back to 2002. And David Boies, the lawyer who was representing Weinstein in his efforts to shut down many of these journalistic investigations, managed to, insert himself and stop that one, as well as later efforts by Ken Aletta.
And also another imprint of Penguin Portfolio, is publishing two more times colleagues of ours. The reporters Kate Kelly and Robin Pogrebin have the book The Education of Brett Kavanaugh. Yes,
that's one of several Kavanaugh books that are in the works, and it'll be interesting, too, to see how those distinguish themselves from each other. But I'm excited for that one as well.
Well, that's because we're book people.
That's right.
Thanks, Alexandra.
Thanks for having me.
Ian Urbina joins us now from Washington. He was, until very recently, an investigative reporter for the New York Times. He still writes for us, but he is doing many other things, including having several of his pieces turned into major feature films, and now has a new book out called The Outlaw Ocean, Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier. Ian, thanks for being here.
Thanks Thanks for having me.
All right. I'm going to start with a very basic question because it would seem like we would all know the answer to this. And I know this is a lot of what your book is about, but I don't think many people do know, like, who governs the seas?
No one and everyone. The seas, if you think of it in two categories, you've got the national waters, which is usually 13 miles or 200 miles offshore, depending on the definition. Those are usually governed by the nation whose waters they belong to. And then there are the high seas, international waters, and that's kind of like outer space or international airspace or the Arctic Circle. These are places that are sort of globally public commons, and everyone but no one governs them.
You have a quote about the tragedy of the commons. What is the concept of the tragedy of the commons?
It's this cool notion that came out of the 19th century and sort of had at its core the observation that when things are held by everyone, by the public, they often get neglected. And this was first observed with grazing parkland that seemed to degrade and just be wasted more so than private land. And on the high seas, it really aptly describes what's happening in international waters where, because it doesn't belong to anyone in particular, it gets neglected.
I think most people who took, a basic earth science class know that 70% of the globe is covered by water. How much of that is international water? How much of that is essentially not mapped out as being controlled by any particular country?
40 to 50% of the planet. So it's a huge space, constitutes this weird jurisdictional realm.
And there's no UN for the sea of any kind.
So there are these governing bodies, right? And they're really screwed up in many ways and well-intentioned nonetheless, but have basic problems. One is they're really siloed. So there are international bodies, most of them rooted in the UN, and agreements that pertain to one issue or another. The Seabed Mining Authority is an example. That's an organization that sort of lays out rules and tries to police them over how the seafloor is used. And then there are agreements for specific fish types in specific regions, tuna in the South Pacific, et cetera. But they're very siloed. And the fundamental sort of flaw of all of it is that there are no police. There are no blue helmets on boats that go out there and patrol and actually enforce those laws. So they really become fairly toothless, and there really isn't any government that's wanting to take ownership in the first place. And then if anyone complains, it's not really clear where you would take those complaints to have them investigated or prosecuted.
So there's the Coast Guard of a country, if they have such a thing, and then pretty much no one else other than these vague organizations that it sounds like don't have anyone to enforce their laws.
Yeah, and in some ways you segue perfectly to the book, right? Because there are no official bodies that are deputized through traditional means to be out there. But yet in that void, there are all sorts of other characters that are sort of deputizing themselves to try to do what governments probably should be. And so that's where you've got conservationists, direct action conservationists, who are sort of acting like vigilantes and interpreting the law to try to enforce some sort of protection, and other sorts of players out there that are operating above or outside the law. Private maritime security is an example of these hired mercenaries that emerged mostly post-2008 in response to the Somali piracy crisis, huge industry of ex-soldiers from Afghanistan and Iraq who go into this space and are armed and essentially can kill, and it's not really clear under whose jurisdiction they fall.
Okay, there's so much in there. I want to just go directly to that 2008 to Somali pirates, because if nothing else, many people maybe saw the movie or know of the story of Captain Phillips, and there's that scene towards the beginning when the ship, Tom Hanks' captain, overtaken by Somali pirates, where they are in the ocean makes a difference in terms of whether someone can go after them. And you also realize, who is the them in this, because there's the company that owns the ship, the people that are on board the ship from other countries. Just explain a little bit about that, because I think that idea of that there are some lines that if you're in Somali waters, it's different from what you can do if you are outside of Somali waters, and also the complications in terms of the shipping industry and who actually owns this boat. Where is it from? Who's in charge?
Imagine you have a spaceship, right? Because ships are essentially vessels. These fishing boats or cargo ships are spaceships. They're traveling through space, and they're these capsules in this odd world. So you have a spaceship, and the spaceship is owned by a guy in one country, and this is a mostly male world, so I'll use guy decidedly, probably flagged to another country. The officers on board are probably from a third country. The crew are likely from a fourth and the fifth country. And that spaceship is traveling through, let's say they're beyond the 200-mile mark from any land. They're traveling through high seas, international waters. All right, so there's your jurisdictional reality, super overlaid and complicated. Now add to it that the guys I described as the crew are most often very poor and from developing nations and do not have the resources to hire lawyers or have sort of political connections. So when things go wrong with them, there's much less chance anyone's going to do anything about it, right? Because these are especially invisible people. Add to that many of them may be debt bonded and trafficked labor. Their passports were taken away. They're owned essentially by the captain until they pay off their debt. They're relatively invisible from that perspective too. All right, so now you have the reality on the boat, and then you have a piracy situation where they may be Somalis or they could be, piracy happens in a lot of places. Off the coast of Bangladesh, huge problem, right? So then on come these armed thieves or extortionists, and they take hostages. All right, well, it's very unlikely that help is on the way. Captain Phillips and the Somali piracy story that captured was distinct, partially because the players involved then were really deep-pocketed, big commercial companies that were moving iPhones and Nikes, and so there were big-time insurers and big-time companies who were starting to feel the pinch. And that's when the international community and all the governing bodies sat up and took note. But piracy continues unabated to a huge degree on fishing vessels and smaller cargo ships still, and it rarely makes the news.
Is money always the motive, or are some of these acts of piracy more political in nature?
Early on in Somalia, there was some merit to the explanation that this was groups of Somalis who were tired of having foreign vessels comb their waters clean with no revenue coming to shore and benefiting their country. And by golly, they didn't have a federal authority and a Coast Guard that would patrol that problem. And so they were going to take matters into their own hands. And tribal leaders sort of deputized these guys, and out they went. And they were, for a while, de facto Coast Guard, sort of extracting taxes of their own sort on these players in a pretty brutal fashion. That quickly changed, and it just became straight-up criminality and sadism. And elsewhere in the world, there's less geopolitical or sort of state involvement or argument. You look at Nigeria, you look at Bangladesh, you look at some of these places, and it's really kind of just criminal gangs that are looking for opportunities.
You have a full rogues gallery of bad guys in this book, from the well-known pirates, mercenaries, traffickers, smugglers, to some that are less reported on. You mentioned a couple that are surprising: sea-bound abortion providers, maybe not terrible depending on your perspective, vigilante conservationists, poachers, oil dumpers, slaves, and it's hard to know where to begin. But let's just talk about some of those more surprising ones. Sea-bound abortion providers, where are they operating, and what's that about?
In some ways, the book is a rogues gallery. In other ways, it's really one that is more about not illegal, but extra legal. It is the outlaw. And so Ocean, and by that I meant that a lot of the people who are acting out there might actually be acting for good.
Yes.
You and I might agree with what they're doing, and they may be on the right side of ethics, even if they're outside the law. And there's a good number of those characters in the book, and toward the goal of trying to diversify the understanding of what sorts of players are out there. I went and spent some time with a woman named Rebecca Gompert, who runs a ship and an organization called Women on Waves. And essentially what she's done for years, she's a former Greenpeace doctor, a gynecologist, and she has a team and a ship. And they, for years, have been going to places in the world, to countries in the world where abortion is illegal and often dangerous, if not deadly, and plugging into sort of an underground network of doctors who know where there are acute needs and women desperate for an abortion. And Rebecca and her ship will quietly enter a country's waters, slip into port, bring some of these women or girls on board and take them out past the 13-mile mark into international waters, where automatically the law then shifts and the law on her vessel becomes that of the flag of her vessel, in this case, Dutch flag, or I think she's now Austrian flag. But in either case, the flag is one where abortion is legal, and she's taking women out of a country where it's illegal. She doesn't do surgical abortions. She does medical, so she's administering RU-486, and she does all the sort of standard, kind of industry standard counseling beforehand and sort of follow-up after, and then quietly brings these women back to shore and disembarks them. Then usually, interestingly, what Rebecca and her organization does is hold a press conference and goes public without the women, making sure that the clients are safely and anonymously away from the scene. Then Rebecca then holds a press conference to try to needle a controversy and a discussion around the issue. That was just struck me as a perfect example of the sort of characters I wanted to chronicle in the book, and so I spent some time on one of her missions off the coast of Mexico.
Well, that brings us to two interesting points. One you alluded to earlier, which is that this is really a man's world, and I want to come back to that. But first, I want to talk about the victims here, because where there are bad guys, there are also people who are suffering. And you mentioned earlier the lives of the fishermen, often very impoverished, often in a kind of near slavery or indentured servitude. What's it like to make your living at sea as a fisherman, or even just as a very low-rung worker on these boats that seem to be not very well regulated?
It's important to distinguish between sort of the coastal local fishermen who go out and come back in a day, be they in the developed world or undeveloped world. Their livelihood and experience is very different than the ones that I was focused on, which are more internationalized. So these are young men typically who are coming from huge number from Indonesia, India, Philippines. They usually work through a recruitment agency in the industry called a manning agency, looking for work. They land a job through the agency on some ship far away. The agency puts them on a plane. Usually the guy pays up front and is in debt just to get the job. He gets sent, let's say, to Cape Town to get on a Taiwanese tuna longliner. And his contract is maybe 3 months, and it has all sorts of, buried in, deductions and sort of Ponzi scheme-like legalistic sleights of hand in the contracts typically, and off they go. And they earn by the day typically on their contract, and the money is often wired or supposed to be wired back to their families, and they work these long trips. And some of these guys are on 9-month tours, some of them are on 3-month tours, and the conditions on the boats. I mean, if you think about a sort of Dickensian factory, and what we even in place, pretty hard scrabble places, be it the coal mines or truck driving or garment factories in Bangladesh or what have you, the norms on land don't much apply to the factories that are these ships. And so the basic things like 20-hour work days are pretty normal and even written in contract as the norm, because when the fish are there, they need to be handled quickly or else they go bad. And you can't really, or at least so the captains say, you can't possibly comply with on-land norms and make this operation work.
Countries have very often labor laws around these things. Why don't they apply to these ships? Is it because of the murkiness of the ownership of the ships? Why wouldn't they have to obey the labor laws from on land?
I mean, this is the shell game of flagging, of flag registries, right? So the laws that apply to you are to the flagging nation of the ship. So if you're on a Taiwanese tuna longliner, you might be flagged to Liberia. You could be flagged to Mongolia, a landlocked nation, and the labor laws that apply to you are not the ones for even Taiwan, much less UK. therefore, as written in Mongolia, point one. Point two, there are incredible exemptions written even in international labor law for the fishing industry. It's one of the furthest behind industries of any. And I think that's just sort of because it has been an out-of-sight, out-of-mind industry forever. There's very little way to enforce, you can't spot check the factory, send someone in and check. And so those who write these rules have been reluctant to write things that they can't possibly check on. So they just have written weak rules. And just the nature of being at sea, the industry has for long argued that they're unlike any other type of work and therefore they need exceptional terms.
It strikes me that the stories that you're telling, the conditions for these young men who go to work on these ships is similar to the women in many of those same countries in the Philippines and South Asia who take jobs in the Middle East, say, as domestic workers, where there's very little protection, that you have these contracts, that there's sort of no one, it's very exploitative, and often there is abuse.
Yeah, it's exactly right, your intuition. And when I went to the Philippines, and because the Philippines, they sort of as a nation decided they were going to have their main export be their people and their workers. And the women, to a large degree, ended up getting exported still as domestics or sort of live-in maids. And I went to the labor agency in the Philippines that specifically is meant to sort of watch over this expat community. And it's a pretty anemic outfit that doesn't really have the ability to do its mission. But I looked through the files and spent a lot of time talking with them about things they see in terms of abuses, and was struck to learn that, I thought that having done sex trafficking as a topic before, I assumed that the very type of worker you're describing, the female Filipino who gets sent to Saudi Arabia, say, to work in a house, is very susceptible to sexual abuse and wage theft and all sorts of other things, violence. And the folks I talked to in Manila were saying they get far more reports, well-documented reports, of the men on these fishing boats when they get back to shore chronicling really severe abuse. That may just because the women stay silent and the risks are higher for them reporting. But I was really surprised to find that the numbers of abuse, reported abuse, are comparable. I thought there would be much more for the women in these homes.
Coming back to the point that the sea is almost entirely the territory of men, what is the impact of this vast expanse that is basically devoid of women?
That's a really good question. I think culturally and sort of from a mental health perspective, these boats become weird places in that they are not just unusually hierarchical, but the norms of interaction. The role that silence plays, for example, is something I tried to tap into. When you're allowed to talk and when you're not really supposed to, and the consequences of breaking that rule, and this sort of anemia of social interaction that exists out there. I mean, the closest thing I could tap into was self-imposed solitary confinement, because even though you are in a place where there are other people there, you're locked in that place, and after a while, you're really not supposed to take up much space with small talk. Now, you asked a gendered question. I mention all that just because I think the macho element of these contexts makes that corrosive thing I'm describing from a mental health perspective much worse. And the sort of guys are guys, and you can tough it out, and the fact that it's unhygienic and hierarchical and violence is fairly normal and gruffness is accepted, I think is really worsened by the fact that it's so overwhelmingly male.
You spent, I think, about 4 years writing this for the Times as a long-term investigative project. How did you go about that? I'm assuming that you were not exactly welcome on board many of these ships as a reporter for the New York Times. Did you spend time on any of these boats? Did you get on them? What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the ambitions, my editor for the series was Rebecca Corbett, and one of the early Times editor, a very famous Times editor, was that we wanted to, as much as possible, get me out into the space, and not to the extent that there had been reporting before, it had largely been done on land, interviewing people as they came back, and thought it'd be great for me to get out there. I had worked previously on ships in grad school when I was an anthropologist, and so I had a feel for the space and the people, and so I really, really wanted most of the reporting to happen at sea on the vessels, and I think it was worth it. It took forever, and it was sometimes unpleasant, but the other question is sort of how I convinced folks to let me on. It really varies. It was a slow process where you just target captains and really have to take them out to dinner and drinks and build a relationship with them over time to convince them to even bring you on board, even just for transit out to another vessel. It's such an insular world that if they're seen with you, especially in these foreign countries in Somalia and Thailand, Indonesia, if they're seen with a Westerner in port getting on their ship, that really raises suspicion among their peers. And so in a lot of cases, when my photographer and I finally convinced them to bring us on board, they'd say, okay, fine, I'll take you out 100 miles and drop you off on another vessel, but you got to get a small boat out 7 miles so no one sees you climbing on board, in port. And so that was pretty normal. But more often than not, people like, as you well know as a reporter, people, if they trust you and feel that you're going to do right by them, warts and all, but right by them in chronicling their perspective and their experience, then they open up. And this was very true here. People were willing to talk once I had shown that I was somewhat fluent in the space and respectful of their world. And I just sort of told them I kind of want to chronicle what life is like and work is like out in these spaces.
Well, it's a feat of reporting. There's so much more in this book that we could talk about, but I have to let you go. Ian, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Ian Urbina is the author of The Outlaw Ocean, Journeys Across the Last Untamed Frontier. Joining us now to talk about what we're reading, my colleagues Tina Jordan, Greg Coles, and John Williams. Hey, guys.
Hey, Pamela.
All right, let's start with you, John, because you've got 2 books.
You see me flipping through them. You said that because you wanted to catch me off guard. I was still prepping, I think, but I'll get to them. Okay, so I'm going to mention a couple of things quickly because I've been reading a lot lately. The first thing is something that I picked up very randomly. It's called Blood, Bone, and Marrow, a biography of Harry Crews by Ted Geltner. It was published a couple of years ago by the University of Georgia Press, and Dwight Garner reviewed it for us in the paper very positively. Crews was this sort of larger-than-life Southern writer who wrote these comic grotesques in the vein of Flannery O'Connor, but even more grotesque. And the only book I had read of his, and still have read of his, is A Childhood, which is his fantastic memoir about his very hardscrabble youth in Georgia. Very harrowing events that happened to him.
That was one of our top 50 memoirs.
And I think it was pretty
years.
high up there. It was top 10 somewhere, which I think it deserves to be when the critics did their top 50 memoirs since 1968. And this biography is great because even though I hadn't really read much of Crews's work, and I still want to, he's such a great character that it doesn't really matter. And Geltner is good about the work. He also, I think the reason I got through it, it's not a small book, it's about 400 pages, is that he breaks it up into these sections of his life, and he's just very good at getting in and out in about 10 pages of something that's a fairly big scene or, a person in his life that meant a lot to him, so that you're always you have that next sight in line. So I would read a few chapters before bed and feel like I had really gotten through a bunch of his life, which was really interesting. He was a dark guy. he was very funny and lively. He became a teacher at the University of Florida in Gainesville. And I think, as someone said to me recently, he wouldn't be around today. He was, had inappropriate relationships with his students. He showed up to class drunk and just kind of ranted about Shakespeare and literature, and eventually became kind of a really strange guy, shaved a mohawk into his head, got all these really strange tattoos, and sort of later in life, and then finally became a very weakened and sort of sick person who Geltner, this reporter, would go and visit. It's a really good biography. I don't know quite why it drew me in, but that's called Blood, Bone, and Marrow. And then I have to say that last night I was up really late, almost finishing a book that I talked about a few weeks ago, which I jokingly said I talked about only to say the title, so I'll say it again: A Wop Bob a Loo Bop a Lop Bam Boom by Nick Cohen. And
3 times fast, John. 3 times fast.
3 times fast. Yeah, this time with feeling. And it's from the late 60s. And just briefly to remind people, he wrote it in just, I think, a few weeks in the west coast of Ireland. He was maybe 21 or 22 at the time. And it's this like elegiac look back at pop and rock from the perspective of 1970 as if it's already done. He's very funny about thinking like, well, after 66, the Rolling Stones were terrible. After he hates the Beatles' more artistic records, and he's really convincing about it. I mean, I read his long chapters last night on the Beatles and the Stones individually, and I realized that, like him, I think when I was younger, I was a real Beatles person, and of course I still love them. But he said, no, the Beatles are obviously geniuses, but they take themselves too seriously. All the arty stuff was bad. It got away from pop, and that's not what it's supposed to be about. And that the Stones, in this sort of, primal way, are the more interesting group. And I kind of actually feel like at this stage of my life, I agree with that. But the way that he writes about it is so aphoristic, so salty. He's so confident as a young 20-something person and so smart. I mean, he really gets all of these big trends about pop music and what it means and why certain people broke out and why others didn't. I just can't recommend it enough. It's just one of the most entertaining things I've ever read.
Well, can we talk a little bit, just do a quick poll, Greg? Stones versus Beatles?
I'm absolutely a Stones guy. I love them both great bands, obviously, both very influential bands. But my kids know I will only turn up the Rolling Stones when I hear them on the radio. Every time, any Stones song that comes on, the radio goes loud.
Tina?
I'm pretty much the same way.
I'm not going to answer.
I'm very much both.
I'm obviously the lowbrow here, the poser, the not real rock person. Greg, what about you?
I'm reading a novel called The Porpoise by Mark Haddon, who's, of course, most famous for his first novel, The Curious Incident of the Dog in the Nighttime, which was kind of a mystery about an autistic kid who witnesses something, and it's how he figures out what it is that he's witnessed. This book too plays with genre. It's kind of a thriller fantasy book, but taking as its base the Shakespeare play Pericles, which draws on Greek myth. I've actually never read the Shakespeare play, but this is a book that Sarah Lyle reviewed for the Daily Arts pages here. A pretty favorable review, so it had been on my radar. And then my local librarian and a bookseller while I was on vacation this summer both sold it to me hard, saying their favorite book of the summer. This bookseller at Mitchell Books in Nantucket said that she had bought like 6 copies. She'd forced it on her husband and friends. And it's a story, it's got kind of a framing device where there's a woman who dies in the opening scene very grippingly. She's an actress, kind of a TV and movie actress, maybe B-level, but quite famous, who dies on an airplane while she's very pregnant, and the baby is saved and delivered even as the mother dies. And the baby grows up cosseted in extreme wealth. The father is like the heir to a tea company fortune, and he soon starts sexually abusing her and keeps her kind of away from the world. And so it's this story of the father and the daughter, and she starts imagining other stories, and that's what takes you into this Pericles thing. I'm maybe 100 pages into it, so I'm not sure just where it's going, but there's a character that she encounters that then she imagines as kind of a Pericles type. And he's being pursued by an assassin who works for the father. It seems, in some ways, it reminds me of this Arthur Phillips book, The Book of Arthur, which also plays with Shakespeare, but in a very meta-fictional kind of a way, and that's what Mark Haddon is doing here, is there's a lot of, it's not clear what's fantasy and what's reality, and all done in this Shakespeare framework. It's beautifully written, sometimes a little chilly or clinical, but it's got this very propulsive plot pulling you through it, too.
Have you guys read Mark Haddon? I've never read him.
I have.
Yeah, I have. I read The Curious Dog many, many years ago.
Yes,
It was great.
And he wrote a book, too, called The Spot right after The Curious Incident of the Dog, which I also read and liked. And it was a very different kind of book. It was like a suburban, dentist or something.
Yeah, and I reviewed, I think, a collection of his stories a couple of years ago called...
I like the "I think" in that sentence.
The Pier Falls, I think it was called, which was also good. He's a really good writer.
Yeah.
Tina, what about you?
So I just finished a book which I think might go like on my all-time top 10 list, guys.
Wow.
That's major.
You've read like 7 million books, so I feel like you're top 10.
This is a book from the 1940s, which we reviewed in 1947 in the paper, and it's called The Corner That Held Them by Sylvia Townsend Warner.
I don't know anything about her. She's kind of a familiar name, but...
I know nothing about her either, and now I need to go find all her other books.
This was re-released by the New York Review of Books?
Yes, it doesn't seem to have ever been out of print. I don't really know how that works. But it is the story of a small, impoverished English convent in the 14th century and its daily life over 3 decades. And not much happens. And everything happens. It's the story of a community. It's a historical novel, but you're not reading it for the history, although that plays out in its pages. You know, the Black Death arrives in the 2nd chapter, for example.
Is there a main character it's told through, or is it a group?
It's told through many different characters and many different viewpoints. Prioresses, nuns, novices, cooks.
I have to say, any movie that takes place in either a convent or a monastery I find curiously compelling and enjoyable, but I haven't read a book.
So this is just daily life.
Well, I guess there's the Umberto Eco.
Yeah, and there's The Nun, which John read within the last couple of months.
There's also one of my favorite novels is Iris Murdoch's The Bell.
Oh, right.
Which is a fantastic book. So,
all right, listeners, what is your favorite book set in a monastery or convent?
Anyway, there's bickering. There's lying, there's avarice. It's just how this small group of women get along.
Or not
in this tiny community. They live, they die, they elect a new prioress. A new novice arrives. It's
sounds like my kind of thing.
When I tell you, you could read an entire chapter about looking for the right workman to construct the spire, and it's fascinating.
I'm curious because it's about daily life, the dailiness of it, but it's also set in a convent. Is there much religion in the book?
No, it's not a religious book at all.
I love that answer.
Not a religious book at all.
And you're done with it, yeah?
I'm done with it.
Okay, all right.
Why, you're going to snatch it off my desk?
I think there's another copy around.
Okay.
Pamela, what are you reading this week?
I recently read Gia Tolentino's book, a bestseller, and of course she was a guest on the podcast. Her book is called Trick Mirror, Reflections on Self-Delusion. And I really loved it. I feel like when I look at contemporary fiction or nonfiction, there are kind of 2 time periods in which you might read it here at the book review, either very early on when you've been to a lunch or you've gotten a copy from a publicist, or it comes in, in the many cartons that arrive in our offices every day, or you have to read it for work for some reason or another. And then there's a couple months later or a month later where all the hype has passed, all the reviews are in, and you can kind of decide okay, now am I actually going to read this? And I admit I was reluctant to read this book because, in a way, it had so much hype and so much praise. And she is, of course, a writer for The New Yorker. And also, there is an essay in the book that had been excerpted in The New Yorker called Ecstasy, which I didn't love. I actually think, for me, that was one of the weaker essays in the collection, although I thought it was better in the book than it was in The New Yorker. Yeah, it needed to be fleshed out. And when she was on the podcast, she talked about how she uses writing. She writes as a way to kind of figure out what she thinks. And she is not a polemical writer. She's very much a little bit of this, a little bit of that, but not in an annoying way. It's in a sort of not just not wanting to be boxed in, but genuinely not being boxed in. She sort of genuinely thinks a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And I feel like she's sort of constantly turning the lens on herself, which I guess is apparent in the title. But for example, she has this essay called Reality TV Me, which is really good. It's about when she was 16, she was in a reality TV program, like a teen thing that took place in Puerto Rico, in which they were largely, I guess, televised or filmed in their bathing suits. And so you kind of know what that's going to be. But she approaches it in such a self-aware way in which she writes about it. And then she says, yeah, but was I really reluctant to go on that TV show? And then she kind of looks at it again. And she's really self-examining in a very honest way that surprised me, because I thought that here was someone who, at least from the outside, seems to be kind of very well packaged and kind of know who she is. But it's a very thoughtful collection. And she covers a lot of territory and is really smart in writing about her generation. People have called her the voice of the millennials, and I'm sure there are many voices of the millennial generation, not just one, but I do think that she is one of the stronger ones.
What's fascinating about the reality TV thing to me is that we're really a generation into reality TV now, and the first real example of it was Real World on MTV. And Dave Eggers, who also was very contemplative,
and the voice of a generation.
And the voice of a generation, auditioned for Real World back when it was starting.
What?
And he writes about it.
That's a big part of
Heartbreaking
Work.
Yeah, exactly. And so there's this kind of thread. You wonder what reality TV has done to writers and this kind of writer.
I smell an anthology.
Yeah, I feel like if you're one of those people, one of those old brittle fuddy-duds like me who's sort of constantly looking at millennials and thinking like, ugh, this is a very restorative book. So
a generation bridging.
Yes.
Peaceful book.
A healing book. I recommend it. Tina, what did you read again?
I read The Corner That Held Them by Sylvia Townsend Warner.
I am still reading The Porpoise by Mark Haddon.
I read Blood, Bone, and Marrow, a biography of Harry Crews by Ted Geltner. And one last time, A Wop Babaloo Bop, A Lop Bam Boom, The Golden Age of Rock by Nick Cohen.
And that time was with feeling. All right. Thanks, guys.
Thanks,
Pamela.
Remember, there's more at nytimes.com/books. And you can always write to us at books@nytimes.com. I write back, not right away, but I do. The Book Review Podcast is produced by the great Pedro Rosado from Headstepper Media, with a major assist from my colleague John Williams. Thanks for listening. For the New York Times, I'm Pamela Paul.